You won't believe what happened after Eleanor Everhart uncovered a hidden love letter buried beneath the floorboards of her grandmother's attic, one addressed to her, but written decades before she was born. What she discovered next shattered everything she thought she knew about her family, her past, and even time itself. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more captivating mysteries like this. Now, let's uncover the secrets behind the letter with her name from the past. Eleanor Everhart hadn't planned on spending her summer knee-deep in dust and forgotten things. She had returned to Waverley, a sleepy coastal town where time moved slower than the tides, to help her aging grandmother clean out the sprawling Victorian house that had stood for over a century. The attic, a place she'd always found both magical and eerie as a child, was now a sea of boxes, rotting trunks, and the scent of lavender mixed with mothballs. On the third afternoon of cleaning, as golden light filtered through the circular attic window, her foot caught on a warped floorboard that creaked oddly. Curious, she knelt and pried it up, revealing a hollow cavity beneath. Nestled inside, among a tangle of cobwebs and dust, was a yellowed envelope sealed with a faded wax crest in the shape of a rose. Her name was written in beautiful calligraphy across the front, Miss Eleanor Everhart, but the ink had faded to a soft sepia. She blinked. The date on the postmark, August 3rd, 1947. Eleanor was only 23. That letter had been written 55 years before she was born. At first, she thought it was a prank, some novelty item meant to amuse. But the paper felt real, textured with age, and the wax seal bore no signs of tampering. Hands trembling, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was elegant, aching with emotion. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "I don't know if this will ever reach you, but if it does, it means time has kept its promise, and love has found its way." The letter spoke of a love that bloomed in secrecy, of stolen moments under train platforms and promises whispered beneath moonlight. The writer, someone named Julian, described her eyes, her laughter, her voice, details that unerringly mirrored Eleanor's own. She read and reread the letter, each time feeling as if someone had taken her life and twisted it through a mirror of memory. How could someone have written to her, about her, long before she was born? Shaken, Eleanor sat on the attic floor, the letter spread before her like a map she didn't know how to read. The air around her seemed charged now, as though the past had crept into the present and curled itself around her spine. She looked through the cavity beneath the floorboards again, hoping to find more, but there was only dust and a brittle piece of red ribbon, frayed at the ends. That night, she couldn't sleep. The letter replayed in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. Her dreams were filled with steam trains and a stranger's silhouette waiting at the edge of the platform, always just out of reach. The next morning, Eleanor brought the letter downstairs to her grandmother, hoping for answers. The old woman squinted at the paper through her thick glasses, then frowned in a way Eleanor didn't recognize, like a long-buried secret had just exhaled its first breath. "I don't know a Julian," she said after a long pause. "But your great-aunt Eleanor, my sister, was said to have vanished in 1948. Ran off with a boy, some said. Others believed she was taken." Eleanor had never heard of a great-aunt with the same name. No photographs, no stories, no trace. It was like she had been erased. "We didn't talk about her," her grandmother muttered, eyes distant. "My parents thought it best." But now, here was a letter, written by a man who loved her and believed she might somehow find his words across the chasm of time. Eleanor's chest tightened. Was it a coincidence? A forgotten name and a shared face? Or something stranger? She returned to the attic with a lantern, her curiosity now an ache. She combed through every box, every trunk, searching for more letters, more clues, more cracks in the world she thought she knew. The attic seemed different now, humming with echoes. In an old cedar chest beneath a pile of winter quilts, she found a stack of linen-bound books. Pressed between the pages of one was a dried white rose, And another letter. This one was addressed to E.E., and the paper smelled faintly of something sweet, honeysuckle, perhaps. "Time is not a straight line," it read, "and love is not bound by it. I will wait at the edge, always." The signature was the same, Julian. Eleanor's hands shook as she held the letter, the ink smudged by what could have been tears. Her own tears now fell freely. What was this? A historical love story buried in the attic? A haunting? A message meant for someone else, or for her? She began keeping the letters in a leather journal, cataloging every detail, the dates, the tone, the references. They read like poetry from another world. Every night, she'd sit by the attic window, the letters laid before her, and read until the candle burned low. Her grandmother watched her with a worried eye, but Eleanor couldn't stop. The past had hooked its fingers into her present, and she was no longer content to let it go. She wanted to know who Julian was. She wanted to know who the first Eleanor had been, and why their stories were starting to feel like one and the same. Somewhere deep in her bones, she felt it. A pull. Not just of curiosity, but of recognition. Like hearing a melody you didn't know you'd forgotten. Eleanor Everhart, 23 and ordinary until now, was no longer sure where her story ended, and another's began. The days that followed blurred together as Eleanor became consumed by the letters, each one an artifact of a love story that grew more intricate, more tragic, more unexplainably intertwined with her own life. She found a total of 6 letters in the attic over the next week, each hidden in increasingly strange places, beneath a floor tile, wedged behind a loose panel in the wardrobe, even folded tightly inside a hollowed-out copy of Wuthering Heights. They were all written by Julian, addressed to Eleanor, and dated between 1946 and early 1948. In them, Julian described secret meetings at the old Waverly train station, moments spent beneath cherry trees in full bloom, and quiet nights where they read poetry aloud while the war still echoed in the distance. The language of the letters was rich and lyrical, so intimate that it left Eleanor breathless. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was how he wrote about her laughter being a sound that could undo storms, or the way her eyes carried the hush of twilight. It was as if Julian had loved her in a way no one ever had, or ever could. Eleanor couldn't explain it, but as she read more, she began to feel something stirring inside her, not just fascination, but familiarity. The details in the letters weren't vague or generalized. Julian wrote about a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind her right ear, about her habit of twirling her necklace chain when anxious, about the scar on her left knee from falling out of a tree. Eleanor had never told anyone those things. It was impossible. And yet, here they were, written in cursive ink on pages that smelled of time. She started dreaming of him, though she'd never seen his face. In the dreams, she was standing on a platform surrounded by fog, and a man with a long coat and a shadowed expression stood just beyond the tracks. He never approached, never spoke. But she woke up each time with the overwhelming sense of loss, like someone had just left her behind. As the mystery deepened, so did her obsession. She stopped responding to texts from her friends. Meals went cold on the stove. Even her grandmother grew worried. "Eleanor, this isn't healthy," she warned one morning, gently taking her hand. "You're chasing ghosts." But Eleanor couldn't let go, not now. The more she read, the more she believed there was something to uncover, something buried not just in the attic, but in time itself. One letter stood out above the rest. Dated March 1948, Julian wrote, "Our time is thinning, my love. They've started watching. We'll meet beneath the clock at Waverly Station. When the bell tolls midnight, we'll run. Promise me you'll come." But no follow-up letter existed. That was the final one she found. No mention of whether the escape ever happened. No answer to what, or who, stopped them. Eleanor began keeping a map of places mentioned in the letters, marking train stations, cafes, alleyways, and gardens. Many no longer existed, but some, like the clock tower at Waverley Station, remained, though abandoned and overgrown. She felt pulled to visit them, not just as a researcher, but as someone retracing her own forgotten steps. When she stood beneath the rusted train platform, wind curling around her ankles, it felt like stepping into the bones of someone else's memory. The silence was heavy, yet charged. She swore she heard echoes of footsteps that weren't hers. The clock overhead had long stopped working, but she looked up at it anyway. Midnight. Stuck in time. Back at home, she found herself writing replies to Julian's letters, not out of madness, but out of longing. She knew it was irrational, but the act of writing grounded her. In one response, she wrote, "I don't know who I am to you, but I feel you, even now, even across time." She tucked the letter beneath the floorboard where she'd found the first one, not expecting anything. But 2 days later, another letter appeared, on the attic window ledge, the wax seal still warm. Eleanor screamed. Her grandmother came running, demanding answers. But Eleanor couldn't explain how a sealed letter, with her name, written in Julian's hand, had appeared from nowhere. This one simply said, "You found me." The clock turns. She began noticing subtle changes in the house. Mirrors seemed to fog from the inside. Her bedroom door creaked open some nights, revealing empty hallways. Lights flickered, but only in the attic. Sometimes, while reading the letters aloud, she swore she heard breathing that wasn't hers. But she wasn't afraid. If anything, she felt protected, watched over by someone who had once loved her enough to try reaching across decades. The only fear she held now was that she might lose the trail, that the final pieces of the story would remain just out of reach. She needed to know how it ended, or if it ever did. When she searched for Julian Everhart, or anyone with that name in Waverley's records, nothing came up. No birth, no death, no residence. It was as if he had existed only in those letters. But when she cross-referenced his descriptions with census data and train registries, a strange pattern emerged. A young man, listed only as J.L., boarded the Waverley Midnight Express on April 1, 1948, but never arrived at the next stop. There had been a minor derailment near Hollow Creek. No fatalities reported. Just one missing person. Julian. Eleanor now felt something she couldn't explain. Grief for a man she'd never met, and love for a story she might be a part of. Each letter had brought her closer to something, an unraveling, a convergence. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a heartbeat, one that had waited over 70 years to be heard. By the time Eleanor finished reading the 6th letter, her room resembled a crime scene, except the only thing she was trying to solve was a memory that didn't belong to her. The letters were now pinned across her wall, mapped and annotated like ancient scrolls. Her journal, once a casual notebook, had become a living chronicle of thoughts, dreams, timelines, and symbols. She scoured her grandmother's home for family photographs, but none contained anyone resembling Julian, nor the other Eleanor. Yet something felt off. There were odd gaps in the family tree, years her grandmother avoided speaking of, and portraits with dates but no names. Her grandmother, increasingly uneasy with her obsession, stopped offering answers. "Some things are better left buried," she said, folding laundry with a trembling hand. But Eleanor couldn't bury what was already digging itself deeper into her soul. At the Waverley Historical Society, Eleanor pored through brittle newspapers and archival microfilm. In an edition of the Waverley Gazette dated July 7, 1948, she found a curious obituary: Eleanor M. Everhart, presumed dead after prolonged disappearance. Beloved daughter of Charles and Harriet. Last seen boarding a train to Hollow Creek. Body never recovered. The photograph printed beside the obituary made her breath catch, because it was her. Not just similar, a perfect match. Her face, her eyes, the way her hair curled slightly over her left temple. It was impossible. The date of death was 75 years ago. Eleanor sat frozen, staring into the face of her own ghost. She copied the article and brought it home, placing it next to the letters. Her hands shook as she considered the implications. Was she a namesake? A reincarnation? A legacy memory? Some nights, she began to feel less like a person and more like a loop, something caught between echoes. Then came the dreams again, clearer this time. She stood in a field of tall grass behind Waverley Station, the moon full above her, Julian standing beneath a flickering gaslight. His lips moved, but she couldn't hear the words. Behind them, the sound of a train horn echoed like a warning. She always woke before it arrived. Desperate, she decided to confront her grandmother one final time. She brought the obituary, the letters, the photograph, and laid them gently on the kitchen table. "Please," she whispered, "tell me the truth." Her grandmother looked at the image in silence for so long that Eleanor wondered if she'd fallen into a trance. "That was my sister," she finally said, voice cracking. "She vanished. They searched for weeks. My parents told me to forget her. So I did. Or tried to." Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. "She looks exactly like me." Her grandmother nodded. "Yes. And no. She had something in her, like you do, always listening to things no one else could hear." Eleanor asked if there had been a Julian. Her grandmother grew visibly tense. "There was a boy. I never met him, but I heard his name whispered. Julian Locke. He wasn't from here. People said he was dangerous. Not for what he did, but for what he knew." When Eleanor pressed further, her grandmother simply said, "I remember the day she left." The wind picked up so sharply, all the clocks in the house stopped at the same time. Midnight. She left the table then, retreating to her room, leaving Eleanor alone with truths that only raised more questions. Armed with a name, Julian Locke, Eleanor returned to the archives. No birth record. No school. No census listing. But she did find something unexpected. A man named Jonathan Locke, arrested in 1949 for trespassing on railroad property near Hollow Creek, raving about a woman lost in time. His mugshot was blurry, but Eleanor swore the outline of his face matched the silhouette in her dreams. The police report described him as unstable, incoherent, and in possession of several letters, none of which were catalogued. She tracked the case to an asylum, now shut down, where its records were sealed due to paranormal incidents and historical interference claims. Eleanor's world was beginning to feel like parchment curled around fire. Every step forward uncovered something that should have been fiction, and yet wasn't. She stopped seeing her reflection the same way. She'd catch glimpses of herself in mirrors and pause, uncertain if the face looking back was fully her own. In her bedroom window, her reflection sometimes moved slightly out of sync. The attic grew colder each night, despite summer's heat. It was as if time itself had taken notice of her meddling. The final sign came on a Tuesday evening. While digging through a chest of old coats in the basement, Eleanor found a small, leather-bound notebook with a floral clasp. Inside was a single pressed forget-me-not, and beneath it, the inscription, "For E.M. Everhart. May you remember what the world forgot." The pages were filled with looping cursive, a journal written by someone clearly in love with Julian. The entries began in 1946, filled with longing and secrets. The final entry was dated April 1st, 1948. "We leave tonight. I don't know if we'll make it, but love is worth every risk. If I disappear, let this prove I lived, I loved, and I chose him." The ink trailed off mid-line. Eleanor's hands trembled as she closed the book. The story wasn't finished, but it wasn't just history anymore. It was her story now. A love unfinished. A mystery that refused to sleep. And a shadow she was no longer sure she wasn't a part of. Eleanor stood at the edge of Hollow Creek Station as dusk settled over the world like a shroud, her heart thudding beneath her ribs like a second clock ticking out of rhythm with the present. The tracks were rusted, the platform rotting, and weeds had claimed what the years had left behind. Still, it was exactly as Julian had described. The old lantern post tilted slightly left, the clock above the ticket window frozen at 12 o'clock, and the remnants of a cherry blossom tree, now bare branches, still clinging to the station's southern wall. She walked slowly, as if stepping onto sacred ground, half expecting time to fold in on itself. The silence here was different. Not empty, but full, like a held breath. She moved to the edge of the platform, running her hand along the rusted railing, and closed her eyes. She could almost hear it, the hiss of steam, the murmured goodbyes, the promise of escape. She came here not because she expected answers, but because this was the place where everything had once changed. In the letters, this was the last stop, where Julian and the other Eleanor had planned to run. But instead of elopement, there had been silence. A disappearance. A name etched in an obituary. Eleanor looked around, searching for something, anything. Then, from behind the old ticket booth, came a shuffling noise. She froze. An old man stepped out, dressed in layers of moth-eaten tweed, a wool scarf despite the summer heat. He carried a cane and wore a look of recognition that startled her. "Took you long enough," he said, eyes crinkling. "You have her eyes." Eleanor stared, unsure if this was a dream, a trick, or fate's hand pushing the story forward. "Who are you?" she asked. The man smiled sadly. "I knew Julian. Or rather, I knew of him. My brother was the station master in 48. Told me stories of a girl who came every night at midnight, waiting for someone who never arrived." Her breath caught. Did Julian come? The man shook his head. The train came. But he didn't. And after a while, neither did she. Until one night, they both just vanished. Some folks said they ran off. Others said the train took them somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. He pointed to the old conductor's bell hanging under the platform's awning. Some nights, long after the station closed, you could still hear that bell ring at midnight. With no train in sight. He leaned closer. "Be careful, Miss Everhart. Some doors don't open both ways." Before she could ask more, he turned and disappeared into the trees lining the back of the platform, leaving her with more questions and the creeping sensation that she was no longer entirely alone. Back at the house, Eleanor began noticing patterns, strange alignments in her surroundings. Her clocks all paused at midnight for brief moments. The attic light flickered exactly 12 times each night. Her dreams became longer, more vivid. In them, she walked through Hollow Creek in a time not her own, storefronts pristine, lamplighters whistling, and people in post-war clothing nodding at her as if she belonged. She began to suspect these weren't just dreams, they were memories. Or perhaps something else entirely. When she tested her theory by falling asleep with Julian's letters beside her pillow, the dreams deepened. One night, she dreamt of the station in its prime. She wore a blue coat, clutched Julian's hand, and they ran past ticket counters and luggage carts as someone called her name. When she awoke, her feet were dirty with soot, and there was a faint trace of coal dust beneath her fingernails. The barrier between time was thinning, and she was somehow standing in the space between. Terrified but entranced, Eleanor confided in her grandmother again. This time, the old woman didn't scold her. Instead, she handed her a small silver pendant in the shape of an hourglass. "This was hers," she said. "Your great-aunt. She wore it always. I found it on my windowsill the morning after she vanished. And I've never touched it, until now." Eleanor turned the pendant in her hand. It was warm. Unnaturally warm. The library became her next destination. She dove into books on time, memory, quantum theory, and metaphysical folklore. In a dusty volume titled Waverley Oddities, A Local History of the Unexplainable, she found a passage that chilled her. It is said the Hollow Creek station marks a tear in the fabric of time. Every 77 years, the air turns still, the clocks pause, and lost loves try once more to find each other. The last occurrence, 1948. The next, 2025. Eleanor glanced at the date on her phone. It was June 13, 2025. The anniversary of the derailment. The year the portal might open again. She returned to the station that night with the pendant around her neck and the letters bundled in her coat. Midnight neared. As the wind picked up and the temperature dropped unnaturally, she sat on the platform bench, waiting. The silence was almost sacred. At precisely 12, the conductor's bell rang once, loud and sharp, despite the fact that no one else was there. Eleanor stood. The tracks began to hum faintly, as if something ancient stirred beneath the earth. A fog crept from the tree line, thick and silver, curling around her legs. And in that fog, the outline of a train began to form, not in rusted metal, but in glimmering light and memory. Just as it reached the platform, everything stopped. No sound, no wind, not even her breath. Time held its breath with her. Then, the door of the train opened with a hiss. And no one stepped out. Not yet. But she felt him, somewhere just beyond the veil. Waiting, watching, calling her name in a voice older than memory. Eleanor didn't sleep the night the phantom train appeared, nor did she try. Her mind pulsed with images too strange to be dreams and too vivid to dismiss as fantasy. The ghost light of the station, the whisper of steam that left no burn, and the aching certainty that someone had almost reached her from the other side. The next morning, she woke on her bedroom floor, still wearing the hourglass pendant, her boots streaked with coal-black dirt. But the strangest thing of all was the smudge of writing on her wrist in fading ink, words she hadn't written. "It's not over." The message wasn't signed, but she didn't need it to be. Julian's handwriting was unmistakable now, seared into her like a second language. Drawn back into the attic, Eleanor began digging deeper, not just into the obvious places, but into the very bones of the house. She knocked on walls, pulled drawers completely out of dressers, lifted rugs that hadn't been touched in decades. Something inside her whispered that she was close. On the third day of searching, behind a low wooden panel near the attic stairs, she found it, a narrow, almost invisible keyhole. Her breath caught. She remembered the journal she had found weeks earlier, the one belonging to the original Eleanor. She'd barely noticed the hard ridge in the spine at the time, assuming it was just warping from age. But now, as she examined it again, she realized there was something embedded there. She peeled back the lining and found a tiny brass key, no longer than her thumb. The key slid into the hidden lock with a click that echoed too loudly in the attic stillness. A panel gave way to reveal a cavity lined with velvet and dust. Inside, wrapped in oilskin and tied with crimson string, was another journal, larger, older, and far more worn than the first. She untied it carefully, heart hammering. The first page read, "The truth of us must be preserved, even if time forgets. My name is Eleanor Everhart, and this is the story of my unraveling." For a moment, the attic spun. It was like staring into a mirror that reflected not just her face, but her soul. The journal was far more detailed than the letters had been. It chronicled every meeting with Julian, from their first accidental conversation in the old library, where he had been researching discontinuities in temporal flow, to their final plan to run away together after the war ended. He had told her things that no one else could have possibly known. He'd claimed he wasn't from this version of 1946, but rather from a time between, a fault line in history where memories drift and lovers get lost. She hadn't believed him at first. But then, clocks around her had begun to stutter. Street lamps flickered without reason. She started waking up in places she hadn't fallen asleep. Julian had been kind, poetic, but also haunted. He spoke often of the others, forces that tried to keep the fabric of time intact, even if it meant tearing apart what didn't fit. He feared they were being watched, that their connection had drawn attention. Eleanor's entries became more anxious as the weeks passed. She began experiencing time slips, standing in 1946 one moment and waking up somewhere else in the same location, but decades ahead. In one entry, she described watching herself, an older version, walk across the street in modern clothing, unaware of her gaze. "She looked like me," she wrote, "but lighter, freer, as though she had forgotten the weight of what we were." Eleanor of the present paused here, shaken. Was she remembering herself? Or had the past bled so far into the present that all the mirrors were facing each other now? The journal continued, "Julian says we may only get one chance. A train, a window, a pull in the night. He calls it the convergence." The entry stopped suddenly, mid-thought, as if the pen had been yanked from her hand. Eleanor flipped the pages frantically, blank. All of them. As if the story had simply stopped. Or vanished. But then she noticed something strange. When she tilted the book under the attic lantern, faint impressions became visible, writing that had once existed but had faded completely. She used a pencil and lightly traced over the indentations. A message emerged: "If you found this, then time still loops. The station. Midnight. The last letter waits." Eleanor nearly dropped the journal. There was another letter. Somewhere. One final piece to the puzzle, and it had waited, just like the rest, for someone who could remember what others had tried to forget. That night, Eleanor tore through the attic with renewed purpose. She searched the floorboards again, retraced every box, every hollow book, every shadowed crevice. Hours passed. Just as she was about to give up, her lantern flickered, and she noticed something odd about the wall behind the armoire. A faint outline, rectangular, carved into the wood. She pulled the heavy furniture aside and found a false panel. Behind it, a small iron safe, hidden for decades. Her hands trembled as she inserted the same brass key. It fit. The safe door creaked open. Inside was an envelope wrapped in oilskin, and this time it bore no date, only a single line in deep black ink, "To the one who remembers." Eleanor clutched it to her chest and sank to the attic floor, overcome with a kind of emotion that doesn't have a name, a storm of grief, wonder, hope, and a love she still couldn't quite call her own. Not yet. The final letter would have to wait until morning. Her hands were shaking too much to open it. But deep down, Eleanor knew, this letter wouldn't be like the others. This letter might not be from the past. It might be from outside of time. The morning air in Waverley felt too still, too composed, like the world was holding its breath, aware that something was about to shift. Eleanor woke with the unopened envelope still clutched to her chest, the oilskin imprinted with the warmth of her skin. She didn't move for several minutes, staring at the faded script, "To the one who remembers." It wasn't just poetic, it was precise. This letter hadn't been written to the original Eleanor. It was addressed to her. The girl 75 years later. The girl who had dreamed of a man she'd never met, who had followed the breadcrumbs of love and memory into the ruins of time. She sat cross-legged in the attic, beneath the watchful eye of the circular window, and broke the seal. Inside was a letter folded twice, the paper still faintly fragrant, lavender and something metallic, like time itself had a scent. She unfolded it, bracing herself for answers. It read, "My Eleanor, if you are reading this, then the loop was not broken, and my words have reached the version of you who was brave enough to listen. We failed, you and I. In 1948, we failed to run. The clock struck midnight, and I never reached the station. They stopped me. Not people, but forces I still don't understand. I fought, but they tore the door away before I could reach you. You vanished into the fog. I feared you had died. But then, I saw you. Not in the past, but in pieces of the future. A girl with your eyes and your soul, standing on the threshold of every echo." Eleanor's throat tightened. Julian had seen her, even beyond death or time. The letter continued. So I stayed. I anchored myself to the one place I thought you'd return to. I waited at Hollow Creek Station for decades, neither dead nor living, watching trains pass through time like shadows. I left letters, hoping one day you'd find them, hoping memory would loop back. And now you have. But I must tell you what the others would not. Her pulse quickened. We weren't just in love. We were tethered, two souls caught in a ripple, always drawn to one another across lifetimes. But the longer we pull, the more the fabric tears. The world tries to correct itself, to forget us. That's why no records remain. That's why the clocks freeze. That's why they erased you. But they can't erase everything. Not love. Not entirely. Tears welled in her eyes as she continued reading. The convergence comes again, this year. This month. The anniversary of our parting is also the opening. The train will arrive at midnight, just as before. But this time, you must choose. If you board, the past may fold into the present, and we may exist again, together. But doing so means leaving behind everything you know. Your family, your name, your now. I don't ask this of you lightly. I only ask because I've waited so long. Find me, if time allows. Julian. The letter ended there, no instructions, no pleas, only a promise woven into impossibility. Eleanor read it again and again, each time hearing his voice more clearly in her mind. Her thoughts spiraled. Could she leave her life behind? Was this real? Was any of this real? But when she looked at the wall of letters, the photos, the journal, and the journal with her face, she knew this wasn't madness. It was memory. The question now wasn't what had happened. It was what she was going to do about it. She tucked the final letter into the hourglass pendant. It fit perfectly, as though the two had been made together. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she wandered the house, touching the edges of things one last time. Her books, her photos, her grandmother's wrinkled hand as she slept. She didn't say goodbye. Some choices don't require words. At 11:45 p.m., Eleanor arrived at Hollow Creek Station. This time, the platform wasn't empty. The clock above the ticket window ticked, ticked, and ticked again. The wind had teeth that night, sharp, cold, and far too alive for a summer evening, as Eleanor stepped onto the platform of Hollow Creek Station for what she knew could be the last time. The entire world felt suspended, holding its exhale in the hush before midnight. The lanterns on the rusted iron posts glowed faintly, though no electricity had powered them for decades. She wore her mother's wool coat, the hourglass pendant around her neck, and carried nothing but Julian's final letter in her pocket. Behind her, the road back to town stretched long and unlit. Ahead of her, something else waited. Something she couldn't explain, but had come to trust like gravity. The clock above the ticket booth ticked steadily now, no longer frozen, no longer stuck in the past. 11:58. She sat on the old bench, hands clenched together, heart fluttering in her chest like a trapped moth. She thought about the life she was leaving, lectures unfinished, birthdays missed, ordinary days she would never live again. But none of that held the same weight as this moment. This was a question written in time, and she was about to answer it. At 11:59, the world shifted. A deep rumble pulsed through the wooden planks beneath her feet. It wasn't the sound of thunder, nor of a car, nor of any machine she recognized. It was older, primal, a low, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat carved into the earth itself. A fog spilled across the platform, silver and silent, curling in tendrils as the wind dropped into unnatural stillness. Eleanor stood, eyes wide. The station lights blinked once, then all flared to life. The conductor's bell rang once. Then again. Midnight. A sound, faint at first, rose in the distance. A whistle. Not mechanical, but ethereal. Melancholy and bright, like a memory sung through a tunnel. The rails began to glow, and from the edge of the mist, a train emerged. It wasn't quite real. It shimmered like a mirage, half light, half shadow. Its windows reflected not the platform, but stars, entire constellations that swirled as though they belonged to some other sky. It slowed, brakes whispering rather than grinding. The door nearest Eleanor hissed open. She hesitated, feet glued to the boards, hands trembling at her sides. Was she ready? Could anyone be ready to leave behind an entire timeline, to choose love over logic, memory over certainty? But even as she questioned, she knew. Her whole life had led to this moment. A pull not of impulse, but of gravity. Of destiny. And then he stepped out. Julian. He looked just as she imagined, tall, worn at the edges, eyes that held galaxies behind storm clouds. His coat billowed gently despite the absence of wind. He held something in his hand, another letter, the ink still wet, as though he'd just finished writing it. When he saw her, his face broke into something she could only describe as home. "You made it," he said, voice choked with awe. "You remembered." Eleanor didn't move. Not yet. She needed this moment to be real. To feel it. "Is this real?" she whispered. Julian stepped closer. "As real as you are. As real as time allows." He reached out, and she took his hand. It was warm, solid, certain. 1,000 dreams, 100 letters, and 77 years of longing condensed into the space between their fingers. "I thought I lost you," she said. "I thought you were gone." "I was," Julian replied. "But I left a thread, and you followed it." She smiled through tears. "What happens if I step on that train?" He looked over his shoulder, then back to her. "We stop being echoes. We become story. Real. Whole. But once the door closes, the world forgets us. It's how the tear heals. Your name, your face, your time, they vanish. No one will remember you. Except me." Eleanor looked back down the road one last time, at the lights of Waverley glinting in the distance. She thought of her grandmother, asleep in her armchair, never knowing the truth. She thought of a life of unanswered questions, of a love that defied time, of a version of herself that had once disappeared without a trace. Maybe this was always how the story ended. Or maybe this was how it began. She stepped onto the train. The door closed. The platform vanished behind her. And as the train pulled into the light, past time, past memory, past names, only the stars remained, and the steady rhythm of a story finally finding its ending. Or its beginning. Waverley did not scream when Eleanor Everhart vanished. It simply exhaled and continued, like a dream fading from memory before dawn. The world adjusted itself as if she had never existed. The house she had grown up in was sold to a young couple who marveled at the strange echo in the attic, but found no trace of any belongings. Her university records blinked out of the system. Her room became an unused guest space. Her grandmother, who had once sworn she would never forget her granddaughter's laugh, suddenly found herself staring at family photos and wondering why one frame felt suspiciously empty. The space Eleanor left behind became absence disguised as order. But it was not perfect. There were fractures. A diary with no name sat tucked into a library donation bin, containing verses about trains and moonlight and letters that disappeared. A clock in the Hollow Creek station, long since condemned, began ticking again, only between 11:59 and 12:01. At exactly midnight each night, the old conductor's bell let out a single chime, though there was no bell anymore. Children claimed to see a girl standing on the tracks in the fog, dressed in a wool coat with an hourglass pendant glowing faintly against her chest. Locals whispered that Hollow Creek had always been haunted, but no one remembered why. Back in the place between time, the train Eleanor had boarded with Julian, life moved differently. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air around her changed. It smelled not of oil and steam, but of lavender, coal smoke, and candle wax. Julian took her hand without hesitation, leading her down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch far longer than the train car allowed. Each door they passed shimmered with a brass nameplate. Some bore names, others only dates. A few were blank. "They're memories," Julian explained. "Each door holds a story that crossed time but didn't belong where it landed." They stopped outside a compartment marked Everhart, lock. The door opened on its own. Inside was a room suspended between eras. A vintage fireplace flickered beside a sleek glass table. On the wall hung portraits that changed depending on who looked at them. Eleanor stepped inside slowly. This wasn't a train in the traditional sense. It was a sanctuary. A vessel ferrying stories too stubborn to fade. Passengers drifted down the hall in silence, some youthful, others impossibly old, all with that same look in their eyes, the look of remembering too much. Eleanor learned quickly that not everyone on the train was like her. Some had boarded centuries ago, drawn by unanswered love, unfinished stories, or time fractures caused by grief. Others hadn't made a choice at all. Some were echoes, remnants of people who once were, replaying their final moments over and over. They were called the Faded. You could pass through them like mist, but if you listened closely, you could hear their whispers, names, regrets, apologies never sent. Julian stayed by her side, teaching her how to navigate the corridors, how to speak to the time lost without being consumed by them. Some passengers still believed they could go back to the lives they left. "They think time is a door you can unlock from both sides," Julian told her softly, "but time, it chooses what it keeps." Eleanor understood this now. She had crossed a threshold. There was no return. But even so, a part of her ached, not for the life she left, but for how no one would ever remember she had been part of it. Days passed. Or something like days. Time aboard the train didn't flow like it did in the world she came from. Dreams bled into waking, and sometimes Eleanor would see visions of other versions of herself, one with longer hair, another laughing under a tree with books scattered around her. Alternate possibilities. Lives unlived. One night, she found a compartment door ajar. Inside was a version of her attic, perfectly recreated. Her journal rested on the floor, pages fluttering despite the still air. On the last page was a sentence she had never written: "Love is a circle. If it ends, it begins." Outside the window, stars drifted by like lanterns in a current. She pressed her palm against the glass. Somewhere in Waverly, someone else was waking up to an ordinary day, unaware of what had been sacrificed to keep the story going. Eleanor whispered into the glass, "Don't forget me." The stars shifted slightly, as if answering. But no one on earth would hear her. Still, remnants lingered. A young girl, barely 13, visiting Waverly with her parents, wandered into the attic of an antique bookshop and found a sealed letter with no name, no date, only a wax seal shaped like a rose. She didn't know why, but the handwriting felt familiar. That night, she dreamed of a girl in a blue coat and a boy with moonlight eyes, boarding a train that glittered like a comet. She awoke with a single word on her tongue: Eleanor. The world had forgotten. But the story was beginning again. Time aboard the train was not linear, not even in the poetic, spiraling way Eleanor had once believed. It stretched and bent, sometimes doubling back on itself, other times pausing altogether like a breath caught mid-sentence. Eleanor and Julian walked the corridors hand in hand, their days unfolding like stanzas of a strange, ever-shifting poem. But the longer they stayed, the more she began to notice the others, not just passengers, but residents, those who had been aboard far longer than they were willing to admit. They were called the time lost, souls who had chosen memory over mortality, who now drifted like half-forgotten verses caught in the draft of eternity. Some of the time lost had boarded the train centuries ago, from cities that no longer existed, from love stories long faded into dust. One man spoke only in the language of dreams. Another wandered the hallways carrying a locket that played a song no one else could hear. A woman in a golden shawl stared constantly into a cracked mirror, searching for a face she hadn't seen in lifetimes. They were tethered here, not by chains, but by memory, by the echo of someone they had once loved so deeply that they refused to move on. Julian called them the static, but Eleanor saw something more fragile in them. They were haunted not by ghosts, but by the fear of forgetting. And the more she observed them, the more she wondered, how long before she and Julian became like them? Was this their future too? Would they become two more names etched into a brass plate, stories with no listeners? Then came the visit from the conductor, a tall figure draped in robes that shimmered like moonlight through a telescope lens. No one knew where the conductor came from, only that he appeared when the train approached a decision point, a moment when a story needed to turn or collapse. Eleanor was called to his chamber alone. Inside was no furniture, only a suspended window that showed all the versions of herself she had ever been. A girl brushing her hair in a mirror, a child reading beneath a blanket, a woman standing alone on a train platform. The conductor spoke without sound, his words unfolding directly in her mind. "You are nearing the edge of memory," he said. "Every soul here must choose, to fade into peace or to carry their memory into a new beginning." Eleanor's voice trembled. "What does that mean?" "Peace means forgetting. Love, names, pain, it all dissolves. You will remain in this place, but without burden. The other path is harder. You will carry your story to another life. But you may be the only one who remembers it." The choice was a knife, one edge comfort, the other sacrifice. Eleanor asked if Julian had been given the same choice. The conductor nodded. "He refused peace. He chose you, over and over, in every version." Tears burned in her eyes. "Then so will I." But nothing happened right away. The train continued its journey through starless space, through clouds that looked like memory, through lightning storms that whispered the names of the dead. Julian noticed the change in her. "You saw him," he said one evening, as they stood in the observation car watching timelines shimmer across the glass like oil on water. Eleanor nodded. "He said we could carry our story into a new life." Julian's expression turned wistful. "Then maybe that's why the loop always starts again. Why a version of you always finds a letter. Why I always remember your name, even when everything else fades." That night, Eleanor dreamed of the first letter again, not the one she had found, but the one she would one day write. She saw her own hand pressing ink to paper, signing a name that no longer belonged to the world. She woke with the memory still vivid. Her choice had set something in motion. A path forward. But as the train neared the next convergence point, tension spread through its walls like frost. The time-lost were growing restless. Some had seen passengers leave before, those who chose to carry their story forward, and they feared what might be left behind. In the dining car, time began to flicker. Forks hovered mid-air. Tea poured upwards. One woman began screaming in French from the 1800s, and a man vanished mid-sentence, never to be seen again. The fabric of the train was coming undone. Julian found Eleanor at the end of the corridor, heart racing. "It's time," he said. "If we're going to move forward, we have to let go." She took his hand. "But I'm not letting go of you." Together, they returned to their compartment and prepared to leave, not through the train's doors, but through memory itself. The conductor appeared once more, opening a shimmering rift in the wall, a door made of light and ink and longing. As they stepped through, Eleanor whispered a promise to the time-lost. "You're not forgotten. You're the reason we remember." And then she was gone. Again. But not lost. Just rewritten. The train had no name. Not in any language spoken aloud. It simply moved, through timelines, through fog, through memory, stopping only when the world had forgotten something worth remembering. When Eleanor stepped through the rift with Julian, she didn't expect to wake in another place. She expected nothing, and yet She opened her eyes to the golden morning light spilling through the curved glass of a library dome. She was alone. The warmth of his hand, so recently in hers, was now memory. But it was not grief. It was purpose. The world she awoke into was not her own, but it was close. The skies of this timeline held 3 moons. Cars glided above cobblestone streets. And yet, within this unfamiliar world, Eleanor recognized certain constants: the hush of silence before a storm, the scent of lavender on the wind, and the gentle pull of a story she knew must continue. The room she stood in was her own, a modest attic converted into a library study, her name etched into a silver plaque beside the window, E. Locke. Not Everhart. Locke. She whispered it, and the sound rang true. She had become both their legacies. The house had no attic floorboards to lift, no chests to open, but it had shelves. Dozens of them. And on one, tucked behind a row of forgotten epics, was a leather-bound notebook already halfway filled. She opened it and gasped. It was her handwriting. Her memories. Her first kiss with Julian in a cherry orchard, the train station at Hollow Creek, the smell of coal smoke on her coat. These pages were the memories she had carried through the rift. The conductor had said she could choose to carry them. And she had. But memories are not just for keeping. They're for passing on. She turned to the last page and began to write. Not for herself. Not for Julian. But for the next one. For the next dreamer, the next girl or boy or soul who would stumble into an attic or a station or a storm and feel something stir deep in their bones. She wrote, "You don't know me, but I know you. You're looking for something you can't name. A pull you can't explain. This letter is proof that you're not alone. I once found one too. I once stood on a platform and made a choice. You will too. When the time comes." She signed it simply, Eleanor. Then she tucked it into an envelope, sealed it with a rose-shaped wax stamp, and left it inside the spine of a hollowed-out novel. Not in her world. Not even in her house. But in a world just adjacent, one she would never live in, yet had once loved. She dropped the book at the edge of a tiny antique shop in a seaside town that didn't yet exist, placing it in a donation bin marked Free T.O. Good Home. Then she walked away, never looking back. Years passed. And then, decades. In another attic, on another rainy afternoon, a 17-year-old boy named Theo Locke, no relation, at least not in this timeline, found the book. It fell open to the page with the envelope. He almost tossed it aside, but the seal caught his eye. It was elegant, romantic, and when he cracked it open, the ink shimmered slightly, as if still drying. The letter didn't speak of science or logic. It spoke of feeling, of standing at the edge of time and stepping forward anyway, of trusting a story, even when no one else believed it was real. Theo read the letter 3 times, then tucked it under his pillow that night. He didn't know why, but he felt different, as though something had clicked, as though someone was waiting for him, somewhere. That night, he dreamed of a girl in a blue coat standing on a station platform, steam rising all around her, her eyes searching the fog. She smiled when she saw him. She whispered, "You remembered." The story had started again, as it always would, because love, in its purest form, doesn't end. It loops. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come.